In this quiet hollow of Carter County stands what remains of the Carter farmhouse. On an April morning in 1923, federal revenue men came up this ridge looking for illegal whiskey. A single shot was...
Between October 3rd and December 18th, 1962, 18 federal revenue enforcement officers died during systematic campaign by Emma Wilson, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for shooting her 11-year-old son Tommy during raid on property in Hancock County, Tennessee, shooting that had been conducted ostensibly to search for illegal moonshine operations, but that had escalated when Agent Marcus Webb had fired weapon-killing child who'd been carrying firewood from barn to house, killing that had been characterized as justified response to perceived threat, when actually Tommy had been an unarmed boy, performing household chores that routine assistance had made innocent activity rather than threatening behavior that deadly force could excuse. By December 22nd, all 18 agents and supervisors who'd participated in raid or who'd authorized shooting or who'd dismissed wrongful death complaint were dead, their bodies discovered throughout eastern Tennessee, where solitary actions by Emma Wilson had systematically hunted and killed federal personnel through shotgun attacks, demonstrating that when governmental authority employs enforcement operations carelessly endangering children, and when systems refuse accountability for agents who kill innocent boys, then grieving mothers will deliver individual retribution that institutions declined to provide, even when evidence documented that Tommy's death had been preventable tragedy resulting from trigger-happy agents rather than from legitimate self-defense that child's actions had supposedly necessitated. Hancock County, Tennessee, occupied 222 square miles of mountainous Appalachian terrain in northeastern corner of state in 1962, populated by approximately 7,000 people working in declining agriculture, in small-scale logging operations, and in minimal coal mining, economically depressed region where federal revenue enforcement operations targeting illegal moonshine production were conducted aggressively, creating tensions between governmental authority and mountain communities whose traditional distilling practices federal taxation had criminalized. The county's cultural landscape during early 1960s was characterized by strong family bonds and by protective attitudes toward children that any threats to youngsters' safety were viewed as unforgivable violations requiring defense through whatever means necessary when systems failed protecting innocent lives. October 1962 meant autumn in Tennessee mountains, where cooling weather was creating optimal conditions for outdoor work, including preparing firewood supplies for approaching winter. Month also marked period when Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms was conducting intensive operations throughout Appalachian moonshine regions, investigating suspected illegal distilling, creating situation where aggressive raid tactics were being employed without adequate concern for civilian safety, particularly regarding children whose presence on targeted properties, enforcement procedures inadequately anticipated or protected. The specific emphasis on rapid, overwhelming force during this period reflected institutional priorities, emphasizing arrests and seizures over careful reconnaissance that proper implementation would have conducted, verifying whether children were present before initiating raids that dangerous tactics might endanger. Emma Wilson was widow, age 34, whose husband Robert had died in 1959, coal mining accident, leaving her alone to raise son Tommy on family's 40-acre property, subsistence existence that garden farming and occasional wage work had sustained, providing modest but stable life for boy, whose bright disposition and whose helpfulness with farm chores had made him beloved throughout community. Tommy Wilson, age 11, had been exceptional child whose eagerness to assist mother with household tasks and whose friendly interactions with neighbors had created widespread affection, boy whose future had seemed promising when good performance in school had suggested potential for achieving more than subsistence farming that mountain poverty typically imposed on children whose educational opportunities were limited. Beyond personal significance, Tommy represented Emma's entire world and represented continuation of family that husband's death had threatened eliminating when widowhood had left Emma without partner, but with responsibility for raising son whose well-being had become singular focus of life, that maternal devotion had organized around ensuring boys' safety and happiness and future prospects. Emma's meticulous attention to Tommy's needs, providing adequate food despite limited resources, maintaining clean clothing, encouraging education, protecting from dangers that rural living presented, demonstrated that motherhood wasn't merely biological relationship, but was sacred obligation whose fulfillment required sacrificing personal interests for ensuring child's welfare, that proper maternal love demanded prioritizing above everything. ATF raid on Wilson property had occurred October 2, 1962, when 20 federal agents had arrived with warrant alleging that Emma was operating illegal moonshine still. Raid authorized based on informant's report that hadn't been adequately verified, but that enforcement priorities had made sufficient basis for conducting operation that would find no distilling equipment, but that aggressive tactics had employed creating dangerous situation where trigger-happy agents had been predisposed toward using deadly force against perceived threats. Approach to property had involved agents surrounding area and advancing rapidly toward house where Emma and Tommy had been conducting normal afternoon activities, including preparing firewood supply for winter heating that approaching cold weather would soon require. Tommy's fatal shooting had occurred when Boy had been walking from barn toward house carrying armload of firewood. That afternoon chore routine had established as normal assistance helping mother prepare for winter, 11-year-old performing household task that rural children commonly executed without any threatening implications that deadly force could justify. Agent Marcus Webb, who'd been positioned near house, had observed Tommy emerging from barn and had fired weapon without verbal warning or without attempting to verify whether child posed actual danger, single shotgun blast that had struck Tommy in chest, causing immediate death. Killing that had been instantaneous, and that had been completely preventable if Webb had exercised basic caution before discharging firearm toward child carrying wood rather than weapon. Emma had witnessed shooting from kitchen window where she'd been preparing dinner, watching in horror as agents had fired at her son, and as Tommy had collapsed dropping firewood while blood had spread across ground creating scene that maternal instinct had immediately recognized as fatal, even before rushing outside, had confirmed that Boy was dead. Emma's anguished screams and her desperate attempts to revive Tommy had been ignored by agents who'd maintained perimeter preventing interference while Webb had justified shooting, explaining that Boy's silhouette emerging from barn had appeared threatening and that carrying object had suggested weapon rather than firewood, characterization that other agents had supported, despite Tommy's small stature, and despite obvious innocence that child's age should have made apparent requiring caution rather than immediate deadly force. Most devastating aspect of shooting had been Tommy's complete innocence and his lack of any threatening behavior. 11-year-old Boy who'd been performing routine household chore that helping mother had made daily activity, suddenly transformed into fatal encounter when trigger-happy agent had fired without verification, creating situation where child's helpfulness had been punished through death, that negligence rather than necessity had caused. Tommy's body lying on ground with firewood scattered around had created visual proof that killing had been unjustified, evidence that no reasonable person could characterize as threatening scenario, justifying deadly force when actually seen demonstrated that agent's recklessness rather than child's actions had caused tragedy. Immediate aftermath had included agents searching property, finding no moonshine equipment, and finding no evidence that illegal distilling had been occurring. Raid's failure to discover contraband had made Tommy's death even more egregious, when Boy had been killed during operation that shouldn't have been conducted based on unverified informant report that proper investigation would have recognized as unreliable before authorizing raid, that aggressive tactics had made deadly. Webb's continued justification, claiming shooting had been necessary self-defense, despite finding no weapons and despite discovering no illegal activity, had demonstrated that institutional culture valued protecting agents over acknowledging mistakes that tragic consequences had created. Emma's formal complaint filed with ATF on October 3rd had described Tommy's shooting as unjustified killing, serving no legitimate purpose, had explained that 11-year-old Boy had been performing household chores and had been completely unarmed when agent had fired without warning or without verification, had requested that Webb be prosecuted for manslaughter and that federal government compensate for child's death. ATF supervisor David Mitchell had dismissed complaint explaining that agents had authority to use deadly force when perceiving threats during enforcement operations, and that Webb's split-second judgment had been reasonable given circumstances that darkness and boy's silhouette had created. Characterization that ignored witness accounts describing Tommy carrying obvious firewood in afternoon daylight, and that treated child's death as acceptable cost of aggressive enforcement rather than as preventable tragedy that negligence had caused. Investigation into Webb's enforcement tactics revealed that Tommy's shooting wasn't an isolated incident, but represented pattern where agent had employed deadly force prematurely during raids, that at least 3 other individuals, including one teenager, had been shot during Webb's operations during previous 2 years, though none fatally. Pattern demonstrating that trigger-happy responses, rather than careful threat assessment, had characterized Webb's approach, creating dangers that proper supervision should have corrected before child's death had resulted from institutional failures, allowing reckless agent to continue conducting operations where innocent people were endangered. Emma Wilson's decision to systematically eliminate 18 federal revenue enforcement officers who'd participated in Tommy's killing was individual determination made during solitary grief at son's grave on October 3rd evening. Same day, ATF had dismissed complaint. Decision represented maternal response, framed within understanding that protecting children was fundamental obligation and that failing to hold accountable agents who killed innocent boys was unforgivable institutional failure that proper justice demanded correcting through eliminating everyone whose participation in raid or whose dismissal of complaints had enabled tragedy that maternal love required avenging. Planning involved identifying who'd participated in shooting or in authorizing raid, determining where agents could be isolated, allowing shotgun attacks from close range, preparing Remington Model 870 pump-action shotgun that Farm Living had taught Emma using for hunting, and that buckshot loads would make devastatingly effective for conducting systematic campaign. Method of shotgun attacks had been chosen because Emma possessed familiarity with firearm through Farm Living, where hunting supplemented food supplies, because close-range buckshot would ensure lethality, making attacks decisive, because shotgun represented rural mountain woman's practical weapon. That underestimation would make effective when agents wouldn't anticipate that grieving mother posed deadly threat. Planning involved surveillance, determining officers' routines, establishing locations where attacks could occur without witnesses, preparing to conduct campaign across weeks, creating terror throughout revenue enforcement, when pattern would become clear that widow avenging son's death was systematically eliminating everyone connected to killing that institutional systems had refused prosecuting. The systematic elimination began October 3rd evening, just hours after complaint dismissal, when Agent Marcus Webb, who'd shot Tommy, was found dead at his vehicle, killed through close-range shotgun blast. To head that investigation would determine had been fired from Model 870, demonstrating execution-style killing rather than random violence. Death that had occurred same day Emma had filed complaint, demonstrating immediate retaliation rather than delayed response. Webb's death created alarm throughout federal law enforcement when shotgun attacks suggested personal vendetta rather than ordinary crime. Realization that would become clear as additional deaths occurred following same pattern, indicating that Tommy's mother was employing rural weapon skills for delivering vengeance that maternal grief had motivated. 5 agents who'd participated in October 2nd raid died October 5th through 15th from similar close-range shotgun attacks while alone at vehicles or while entering homes, killings that confirmed pattern when investigation recognized that all victims had been present during operation where Tommy had been shot, and that perpetrator was targeting specific individuals rather than attacking random officers. Pattern continued throughout October and November, with agents and supervisors dying through shotgun attacks that ballistics analysis determined came from same Model 870. Victims found with devastating buckshot wounds that close range had made instantly fatal, demonstrating that attacks were being executed with farm-learned marksmanship that decades of rural living had developed, making widow formidable adversary that law enforcement had catastrophically underestimated. Most disturbing aspect of campaign was targeting of ATF supervisors who'd authorized raid or who'd dismissed complaint. 7 officials, including 3 regional supervisors, dying between November 10th and December 5th, who investigation would discover had been involved in decision to conduct raid based on unverified informant report or had been responsible for dismissing Emma's wrongful death complaint, targeting demonstrating that Widow was eliminating not just agents who directly participated in shooting, but was punishing everyone whose administrative decisions had enabled Tommy's death or whose refusal to prosecute had denied justice that maternal love required obtaining. Deaths of high-ranking officials created panic throughout ATF when it became clear that grieving mother was systematically eliminating anyone connected to son's killing, regardless of whether targets were field agents or were supervisors whose bureaucratic roles had facilitated tragedy. By December 18th, 18 agents and supervisors were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, ATF, and Tennessee law enforcement, deploying hundreds of personnel attempting to identify perpetrator and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of everyone who'd participated in or who'd authorized raid within 11 weeks demonstrated capability and determination that authorities hadn't anticipated from Widow, whose grief had seemed to render her helpless rather than dangerous. Investigation had focused eventually on Emma, given obvious motive following Tommy's death, but establishing direct evidence linking her to killings proved difficult when attacks had occurred without witnesses, and when Emma maintained she'd been at home during times when murders occurred, defense that rural isolation had made plausible until surveillance finally caught her approaching agents' residence with shotgun. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed Emma Wilson positioning herself near residence of ATF supervisor. Surveillance team intervened before attack could occur, discovering Emma carrying Remington Model 870, loaded with buckshot and wearing dark clothing. Arrest that prevented additional death, and that provided opportunity for interrogation producing confession, when Emma acknowledged that systematic campaign had been motivated by avenging Tommy's death and by punishing everyone whose participation in raid or whose dismissal of complaint had enabled killing that maternal obligation, required defending against through eliminating agents who'd shot. Innocent child performing household chores, written confession, detailed 18 killings with matter-of-fact descriptions, emphasizing that each victim had deserved death for participating in Tommy's shooting, or for authorizing raid based on unverified information, or for dismissing complaint rather than prosecuting agent who'd killed 11-year-old boy. That campaign had been understood as maternal duty rather than as revenge when protecting children, was fundamental obligation that institutions had failed performing, creating necessity for individual action. Confession emphasized that Tommy had been completely innocent child helping mother with firewood when agent had fired without warning or verification. That boy's death had been preventable tragedy, that negligence rather than necessity had caused making everyone connected to raid culpable for killing that proper procedures would have avoided. Most remarkable aspect of confession was maternal framework Emma had employed justifying violence, written account explaining that losing Tommy had destroyed her world, when son had been everything following husband's death in 1959 coal mining accident, that watching 11-year-old shot while carrying firewood had been experiencing maternal failure at protecting child whose safety had been paramount responsibility. That systematic elimination had been necessary for ensuring that agents who killed innocent children would face consequences when legal systems refused prosecuting negligent homicide that Tommy's death clearly represented. Confession explained that being dismissed as just grieving woman had made systematic campaign possible when agents hadn't anticipated that Widow would be capable of conducting coordinated violence, underestimation that maternal determination had exploited for delivering retribution that institutions had declined providing. Trial for 18 murders occurred in March 1963 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville, where Emma Wilson faced prosecution for killing law enforcement officers and civilian supervisors. Case that attracted national media attention, both because shotgun attacks demonstrated Widow's determination and because defense's emphasis on child's wrongful death as provocation raised questions about whether killing innocent 11-year-old during raid had created grievances that might partially excuse systematic violence. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including Emma's detailed confession, Remington Model 870 recovered when arrested, ballistics analysis proving shotgun had fired buckshot killing all victims, systematic pattern demonstrating premeditation rather than spontaneous violence that maternal grief might have immediately provoked. Defense didn't dispute that Emma had participated in planning and executing systematic shotgun campaign, but argued that actions had been desperate response to profound tragedy that Tommy's shooting represented when 11-year-old boy had been killed while performing innocent household chore, that carrying firewood from barn obviously demonstrated, that agent's failure to verify threat before firing, and that ATF's dismissal of wrongful death complaint had left grieving mother without legal remedies for obtaining justice when systems had refused prosecuting negligent homicide that child's death clearly constituted. Defense presented testimony from child safety advocates and from law enforcement experts, explaining that raid tactics in 1962 inadequately protected children whose presence on targeted properties enforcement procedures should have anticipated and accommodated, that Tommy's shooting had been preventable tragedy that proper reconnaissance would have avoided through verifying family composition before conducting aggressive operation where deadly force might be employed. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony describing Tommy's innocence, witnesses explaining that 11-year-old boy had been beloved throughout community for helpfulness and for bright disposition, that performing household chores including carrying firewood was routine activity that rural children executed daily without any threatening implications, that Webb's claim about perceiving threat had been contradicted by afternoon daylight and by Tommy's small stature and by obvious innocence that child's age should have made apparent requiring caution rather than immediate deadly force. Neighbors testified that Tommy had been excited about upcoming birthday and about school performance that suggested promising future. That boy's death had devastated community, creating widespread sympathy for Emma, whose maternal grief everyone understood as profound loss that institutional indifference had compounded through refusing to prosecute agent whose negligence had killed innocent child. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of Tommy's death being tragic, and regardless of ATF's failure to prosecute agent, systematic assassination of 18 federal personnel through close-range shotgun attacks constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming maternal vengeance or through arguing that wrongful death of child excused coordinated violence against everyone connected to raid. Prosecutors noted that victims had included 7 supervisors whose participation had been administrative rather than involving direct shooting, that killing 18 people for one child's death represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Tommy had been completely innocent and that shooting had been preventable through proper procedures. Jury deliberated 21 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 18 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee federal court history reflected extraordinary complexity evaluating widow whose maternal grief had motivated violence that child's wrongful death had provoked. Deliberations that required assessing whether each killing had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, while also grappling with questions about whether Tommy's shooting had created provocations that might partially excuse systematic campaign. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been profoundly sympathetic to Emma's loss and had been disturbed by evidence that Tommy's death had been preventable, but that shotgun attacks' systematic nature and inclusion of supervisory targets had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than spontaneous violence that maternal grief might have immediately provoked. Judge sentenced Emma to life imprisonment without parole on multiple counts to be served consecutively, effective life sentence acknowledging severity of killing 18 people, while noting that child's wrongful death and ATF's dismissal of complaint created mitigation that death penalty consideration had rejected. Sentencing created controversies when child safety advocates argued punishment was excessive, given Tommy's preventable death, while law enforcement organizations maintained that systematic murder of officers and supervisors deserved unqualified condemnation, regardless of whether maternal grief had motivated violence. Emma Wilson died in federal prison in 2008. At age 80 from natural causes, having served 45 years, had maintained throughout imprisonment that Tommy's death had justified eliminating everyone involved, that protecting children was fundamental obligation that institutions had failed performing when refusing to prosecute agent who'd killed innocent 11-year-old boy performing household chores. Emma had refused requests for clemency, explaining that acknowledging wrongdoing would dishonor Tommy's memory and would suggest that son's death had been acceptable when actually defending child's innocence had required employing violence that maternal love demanded. Solitary prisoner, whose reputation as devoted mother had made her respected figure among inmates who viewed her as woman who'd defended son's memory against governmental indifference. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought renewed attention to Wilson case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained ATF files and raid authorization documents. Research revealed that Webb had systematically employed excessive force during operations and that supervisors had known about pattern but had tolerated tactics because aggressive enforcement was valued for producing arrests even when such approaches endangered civilians, including children, whose safety proper procedures should have prioritized. Morrison published findings in 2022 book titled Tennessee Widow, How Child's Wrongful Death Created Mother's Vengeance, comprehensive examination documenting raid procedures, child safety considerations, maternal grief, systematic shotgun campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that ATF officials had known that raid was based on unverified informant report but had authorized operation anyway because enforcement priorities emphasized conducting maximum operations regardless of intelligence quality. That internal communications had minimized concerns about civilian safety, including children's presence, suggesting that institutional culture viewed aggressive tactics as more important than protecting innocent lives that enforcement procedures inadequately considered. Correspondence revealed that some supervisors had actually discouraged careful reconnaissance that would have identified Tommy's presence before conducting raid, creating culture where speed and surprise were prioritized over safety. That proper implementation would have required ensuring through verifying family composition and establishing procedures protecting children from deadly force that trigger-happy agents might employ. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2024, film titled When Children Die in Raids. Emma Wilson's Maternal Justice, featuring interviews with child safety experts, law enforcement reform advocates, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Wilson family expressing perspectives about whether systematic shotgun campaign had been justified response to Tommy's wrongful death. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both profound tragedy that killing innocent 11-year-old represented and 18 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased individuals' degrees of culpability for Tommy's shooting or for raid authorization. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with Martha Wilson, age 73 in 2024. Emma's niece who'd known Tommy and who'd attended his funeral. Martha explained that Tommy had been sweetest child who'd loved helping Aunt Emma with farm chores. Watching federal agents kill him while he was carrying firewood for winter heating destroyed our family in ways that never healed. Seeing Agent Webb claim shooting was justified self-defense when 11-year-old boy was obviously unarmed and was performing innocent household task, felt like agents cared more about protecting themselves than about admitting they'd killed child through negligence. ATF dismissing Aunt Emma's complaint rather than prosecuting Webb for manslaughter, communicated that Tommy's life was worthless compared to protecting federal authority. Aunt Emma believed defending her son's memory required punishing everyone whose participation in raid or whose refusal to prosecute had enabled tragedy that proper procedures would have prevented. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 18 killed individuals. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained relatives had been murder victims, whose shotgun deaths deserved unqualified condemnation, to those who acknowledged deceased family members had participated in or had authorized raid where child's preventable death had resulted from institutional failures. Several families described how learning details about Tommy's innocence and about Webb's pattern of excessive force had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence, had evolved into recognition that systemic problems had created an environment where child safety was inadequately prioritized, creating tragedy that desperate maternal response had made explosive. Federal government conducted review in 2023, examining law enforcement raid procedures regarding children. Review identified patterns where aggressive tactics had inadequately protected minors whose presence on targeted properties enforcement operations should have anticipated and accommodated. That deadly force protocols didn't adequately require verification, preventing situations where children might be mistaken for threats. That complaint processes inadequately addressed wrongful deaths of minors, making families feel that obtaining justice required extra-legal responses. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing incidents where raid procedures endangered children and where systems' failures to prosecute negligent homicides created profound grievances that evidence suggested could motivate violence when mothers experienced institutional indifference to sons' deaths. Federal legislation passed in 2024 established Tommy Wilson Child Safety during Law Enforcement Operations Act, requiring federal and state agencies to implement strict protocols protecting children during raids, requiring that reconnaissance verify whether minors are present before conducting operations, where deadly force might be employed, establishing presumptions against using deadly force when children might be endangered, creating independent review for complaints about child deaths during enforcement, mandating prosecution when evidence suggests negligent homicide rather than justified defensive shooting. Legislation was named for Tommy, recognizing that his death had exposed institutional failures requiring reforms, that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards ensuring that children's safety was prioritized over aggressive enforcement tactics that proper procedures would accommodate, through verifying family composition and through establishing safeguards, preventing trigger-happy agents from killing innocent minors. Historical marker installed at Wilson property, where Tommy had been shot, reflected balanced approach. Emma Wilson, 1962, systematically killed 18 federal revenue enforcement officers and supervisors following wrongful death of her 11-year-old son Tommy during ATF raid at this location. Agent Marcus Webb shot child who was carrying firewood from barn to house. Killing that was characterized as justified response to perceived threat, despite Tommy being unarmed and performing routine household chore. ATF dismissed wrongful death complaint. Emma conducted shotgun campaign using farm-learned skills. Convicted after 21-day jury deliberation, served 45 years until death. Case prompted federal reforms, including Tommy Wilson Child Safety Act. This site reminds us that children deserve protection during raids, that wrongful deaths require accountability, that maternal love demands defending innocent sons' memories. By 2024, Wilson case remained most studied example, examining intersection of maternal grief and law enforcement accountability following child deaths during raids. Case studied in training about protecting children and about understanding that minors' wrongful deaths create profound grievances requiring institutional responses that prosecution and compensation should provide, rather than forcing desperate individual actions. Modern child safety and law enforcement reform movements invoke Emma Wilson as symbol of maternal devotion, defending sons' memory, argue that systematic shotgun campaign, while legally unjustifiable, represented desperate assertion that children's lives matter, and that agents who kill innocent minors through negligence must face consequences when systems refuse prosecuting preventable tragedies. Comparative analysis examining Wilson's 18 victims revealed complex picture, where Agent Webb had shot Tommy and had characterized killing as justified, making him primary target, whose death no one disputed was intentional focus of campaign. 5 agents who'd participated in October 2nd raid had been present when child was killed, creating responsibility that shotgun attacks had treated as warranting death. 7 supervisors who'd authorized raid, or who'd dismissed complaint, had made administrative decisions enabling tragedy. 5 remaining victims had been regional officials whose involvement had been peripheral, without directly authorizing operation, but whose supervisory roles in enforcement program had made them targets when Emma's campaign had expanded beyond immediate perpetrators to include broader institutional apparatus that child safety inadequately prioritized. This distribution raised questions about whether killing 5 peripheral officials and 7 supervisors represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Tommy's death had been preventable and that institutional dismissal of complaint had denied justice. Modern scholarship examining Wilson case within broader context of law enforcement raid procedures has revealed that Tommy's shooting represented pattern during 1960s-1970s when aggressive tactics emphasizing rapid, overwhelming force inadequately protected civilians, including children, whose presence on targeted properties enforcement procedures should have anticipated and accommodated through reconnaissance and through deadly force protocols requiring verification before shooting. Comprehensive analyses examining this period have documented dozens of incidents where minors had been endangered or injured during raids, that officials had prioritized enforcement objectives over safety considerations, creating accumulated grievances that occasionally exploded into violence when specific tragedies represented violations that families couldn't accept without demanding accountability that institutional systems refused providing. What distinguished Wilson case from other raid fatality conflicts was combination of victim being 11-year-old child rather than adult civilian, Tommy being shot while performing obvious innocent household chore that carrying firewood clearly demonstrated, Emma being widow whose maternal grief following husband's previous death made son's killing into total devastation of family. Systematic campaign being conducted by female protagonist employing rural weapon skills that underestimation had made effective, life imprisonment spanning 45 years, making case among longest sentences served by woman before death in custody. Trial raising unprecedented questions about whether child's wrongful death during raid could ever partially excuse systematic murder that maternal love had motivated. Federal legislation being named for child victim rather than for perpetrator, recognizing that reform's purpose was preventing tragedies like Tommy's death, rather than merely responding to violence that grief had created. By 2024, 62 years after shotgun campaign and 16 years after Emma's death in prison, descendants of some 18 killed individuals had established dialogue with Wilson family members, efforts that had been initiated by Jennifer Webb, age 45, whose grandfather Agent Marcus Webb had shot Tommy. Jennifer had contacted Wilson family, explaining that understanding maternal grief's intensity was necessary for her family to achieve closure about grandfather's actions and about whether shooting had been justified self-defense or had been negligent homicide that prosecution should have addressed. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic shotgun attacks or defending maternal vengeance couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some victims' families maintained that dialogue with family whose member had murdered relatives was inappropriate regardless of child's death context, argued that focus should remain on 18 deaths rather than on Tommy's shooting that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Wilson family members opposed reconciliation, explaining that Emma had died in prison defending Tommy's memory and that acknowledging wrongdoing would dishonor both mother's sacrifice and child's innocence. That engagement with victims' families suggested acceptance of legal system's judgments, when actually they viewed imprisonment as unjust punishment for defending son against institutional indifference. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including Emma, who died in prison, and Tommy, whose death had triggered tragedy, and 18 people whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how child's wrongful death and institutional failures had combined, creating cascading violence affecting multiple generations. Jennifer Webb's reconciliation work had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her grandfather had systematically employed excessive force during operations, creating pattern that proper supervision should have corrected before child's death had resulted, that Tommy's shooting had been preventable through basic verification, that boy carrying firewood obviously wasn't threatening scenario, justifying deadly force. Revelation that had created questions about whether grandfather had been criminally negligent, rather than being agent conducting justified defensive shooting. Jennifer's conversations with Wilson family members had revealed that Tommy's death, while triggering immediate violence, had occurred within context of broader institutional culture, where child safety was inadequately prioritized, and where complaints about wrongful deaths were routinely dismissed protecting agents rather than prosecuting negligence. That maternal grief had been compounded by systems' refusal to acknowledge that 11-year-old's death represented tragedy requiring accountability rather than being acceptable cost of aggressive enforcement. This broader context had become important in reconciliation dialogues because it explained why Emma's violence had been so systematic and had included supervisory targets whose administrative decisions had enabled Tommy's death or had dismissed complaint, helped participants understand that while shotgun campaign couldn't be legally justified, it had represented culmination of institutional failures affecting not just Wilson family, but entire communities whose children enforcement operations endangered through inadequate safety procedures and through refusing to prosecute agents whose negligence killed innocent minors. Understanding that Tommy's death had been experienced not as isolated tragedy, but as demonstration that children's lives were less important than protecting federal authority, helped victims' families comprehend why maternal response had been so extreme. While understanding that 18 deaths had affected families, regardless of whether deceased individuals had shot Tommy or had merely authorized raid, helped Wilson descendants recognize that violence had created suffering, exceeding what any child's death could justify. Contemporary debates about Wilson case reflected broader conflicts about limits of law enforcement tactics when operations endanger children, about whether wrongful death of minor can ever justify coordinated violence, about how societies should balance enforcement objectives against protecting innocent lives. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters who viewed dialogue as path toward healing and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning shotgun attacks rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify campaign that had killed 18 people for one child's death, regardless of how profound maternal grief had been. The enduring questions that Wilson case raises about appropriate protections for children during raids, about whether wrongful death of minor warrants violent response when legal remedies are unavailable, about how maternal grief can motivate extreme violence when institutional systems dismiss complaints, about whether systematic killing of supervisors whose administrative decisions enabled child's death creates accountability. These remain unresolved 62 years after shotgun campaign, continue shaping debates about child safety protections, about preventing raid procedures that endanger minors, about limits of justifiable violence defending innocent children's memories. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions inadequately protect children and when grieving mothers respond through systematic violence claiming maternal love required defending sons' innocence. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about Tommy's preventable death and 18 deaths affecting families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in shooting. Modern child safety advocacy movements invoke Wilson case when advocating for stronger protections during law enforcement operations, argue that current laws inadequately prevent raids from endangering children or inadequately prosecute agents whose negligence kills innocent minors. That Tommy Wilson Child Safety Act, while important, represents minimum standards that should be expanded to include presumptions against conducting operations where children are present and to require automatic prosecution when evidence suggests negligent homicide rather than justified shooting. Critics counter that emphasizing child protections risks obscuring that 18 human deaths resulted from Tommy's shooting, that focus should remain on preventing violence rather than on expanding restrictions that might constrain legitimate enforcement even when children might be present. Descendants of Wilson family, including Martha, expressed nuanced perspectives about Emma's systematic violence. Martha acknowledged that killing 18 people had created victims whose families had suffered, regardless of whether deceased individuals had shot Tommy or had authorized raid, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing maternal context, where losing 11-year-old son, following husband's previous death, had devastated Emma, leaving her without family and without purpose. Except defending boy's memory against institutional indifference that complaint dismissal had demonstrated. Martha's balanced position created some controversy within broader child safety advocacy community, where some argued that any acknowledgement of shotgun campaign's excessiveness risked betraying Emma's defense of Tommy's innocence, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that violence had exceeded what any child's death could justify when 7 supervisors and 5 peripheral officials had been killed. Federal legislation establishing child safety protections prompted examination of broader patterns where law enforcement operations had historically endangered minors. Department of Justice analysis, examining approximately 1,200 incidents from 1950-2000 period where children had been present during raids, identified systematic patterns where aggressive tactics had inadequately anticipated or protected minors, whose presence proper reconnaissance would have identified. That deadly force protocols had inadequately required verification, preventing situations where children might be mistaken for threats. That complaint processes had routinely dismissed wrongful death claims protecting agents rather than prosecuting negligence when evidence suggested preventable tragedies. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive child safety training, for strict accountability when minors are killed during operations, for independent review when families file wrongful death complaints, for requiring clear justification before any operation involving children can be authorized. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Wilson case emphasizes that protecting children serves fundamental obligation and practical function preventing violence, that understanding maternal grief's intensity when sons are killed through negligence is necessary for recognizing that institutional dismissal of complaints creates profound grievances requiring accountability through prosecution and compensation rather than forcing desperate individual responses. That child deaths communicate institutional indifference, undermining law enforcement legitimacy and creating resentments that entire communities might support when mothers interpret wrongful deaths as requiring retribution that maternal love demands. Training materials cite specific example of Tommy's shooting resulting in 18 deaths as demonstration that inadequate child protections create cascading harms affecting law enforcement communities throughout regions, consequences that proper procedures and prosecution would have prevented if officials had recognized that killing 11-year-old carrying firewood represented preventable tragedy, requiring accountability, rather than being acceptable cost that aggressive enforcement excused through claiming justified self-defense. International law enforcement examining child safety protections frequently cite Wilson case as example, demonstrating consequences when operations fail protecting minors. Scholars note that children globally deserve special protections during enforcement operations, that verification requirements and deadly force restrictions should provide preventing situations where innocent youngsters become casualties that proper procedures would have avoided. Research examining child enforcement conflicts across multiple nations has revealed patterns where minors' deaths have motivated violence. That Wilson shotgun campaign, while extreme in its systematic precision, exemplified broader phenomenon where populations experience profound grief when institutional systems inadequately protect children whose deaths create grievances, that maternal love transforms into demands for accountability, that desperate measures deliver when official channels refuse providing justice. By 2024, the property where Tommy had been shot had been designated as memorial site. Structure erected displaying photographs of 11-year-old boy showing Tommy's bright disposition and innocence that community had loved. Containing educational materials, explaining child safety importance during raids, and describing how proper procedures would have prevented tragedy through reconnaissance, verifying family composition before conducting operation where deadly force might be employed. Physical memorial included replica, showing firewood scattered where Tommy had dropped load when shot, Visual representation that boy had been performing innocent household chore, that obvious carrying demonstrated, wasn't threatening behavior, justifying immediate deadly force that agent had employed without verification. Memorial site included recorded testimony from neighbors who'd known Tommy, interviews describing how 11-year-old had been helpful child, whose eagerness to assist mother with chores had made him beloved throughout community, explaining that boy had been excited about upcoming birthday and about school performance that suggested promising future, confirming that Tommy's death had devastated everyone who'd known child, whose innocence made shooting particularly tragic, and whose preventable death institutional indifference had made unforgivable. Recordings emphasized that forcing Emma to accept that son's killing wouldn't be prosecuted had created a situation where maternal grief had no outlet except violence, that institutional dismissal had made inevitable when systems refused acknowledging that child's death represented negligent homicide requiring accountability. Memorial site's educational placards explained raid procedure problems in 1962, described how aggressive tactics emphasizing speed and surprise inadequately protected children whose presence proper reconnaissance would have identified, explained how deadly force protocols inadequately required verification, creating situations where agents might shoot innocent people performing ordinary activities that careful assessment would have recognized as non-threatening. Materials noted that Tommy's death had been preventable through basic caution, that requiring Webb to verify threat before firing would have allowed identifying 11-year-old carrying firewood as child performing household chore rather than as threat justifying deadly force, that institutional culture valuing aggressive enforcement over safety considerations had created tragedy that proper priorities would have prevented. Memorial site's complementary exhibit honored 18 killed individuals, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable if child safety had been prioritized, or whether deaths represented inevitable consequences when enforcement operations systematically endangered minors, whose wrongful death systems refused prosecuting. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narratives celebrating Emma's resistance or condemning shotgun violence, acknowledged complexity requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about child protection, about preventing negligent homicide, about limits of violence defending innocent children's memories. Until next time, remember that Emma Wilson systematically killed 18 federal revenue enforcement officers and supervisors after Agent Marcus Webb shot her 11-year-old son Tommy during ATF raid at family property. That boy had been carrying firewood from barn to house, performing routine household chore, when Agent fired without warning or verification, killing child who'd been completely unarmed and whose small stature and obvious innocence should have required caution rather than immediate deadly force. That ATF dismissed wrongful death complaint, characterizing shooting as justified self-defense, despite Tommy being innocent 11-year-old helping mother prepare for winter. That Emma conducted shotgun campaign, employing Remington Model 870, and farm-learned marksmanship, eliminating everyone who'd participated in raid or who'd authorized operation or who'd dismissed complaint. That 21-day jury deliberation examined whether child's wrongful death could partially excuse murders before convicting on all counts. That Emma served 45 years until death, maintaining that defending Tommy's memory had been maternal obligation requiring punishing agents whose negligence had killed innocent son. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Tommy Wilson Child Safety Act, requiring strict protocols protecting children during raids and mandating prosecution when evidence suggests negligent homicide, and that ultimately children deserve protection recognizing minors' special vulnerability. That wrongful deaths require accountability, that prosecution must provide. That maternal grief creates profound obligations defending innocent sons' memories when institutional systems dismiss complaints rather than acknowledging that preventable tragedies represent failures requiring addressing through reforms and through justice rather than through protecting agents whose negligence killed 11-year-old boys performing household chores that obvious innocence made. Shooting into unjustified homicide that proper procedures would have prevented through reconnaissance and through verification. The broader implications of Wilson case extended beyond individual tragedy. When researchers examining ATF enforcement culture during 1960s discovered that Webb's pattern of excessive force had represented systematic problem where agents were actively discouraged from exercising caution, when institutional priorities emphasized demonstrating federal authority through aggressive tactics that proper concern for civilian safety would have moderated through requiring verification before employing deadly force. Comprehensive studies examining this period revealed that federal revenue enforcement operations had killed or injured approximately 40 civilians, including 6 children, during 1960-1965 period across Appalachian regions, that officials had characterized such casualties as acceptable costs of conducting operations, rather than as preventable tragedies that proper procedures would have avoided. That families who'd filed wrongful death complaints had been routinely dismissed through characterizing shootings as justified responses to perceived threats, even when evidence contradicted such claims, demonstrating that institutional culture systematically protected agents rather than holding accountable those whose negligence had killed innocent people, including children whose vulnerability should have required special protections. Emma Wilson's life before Tommy's death had been characterized by resilience overcoming hardship. Woman who'd married Robert Wilson in 1948 at age 20 and who'd worked alongside husband operating 40-acre farm while raising son born in 1951. Family that had achieved modest stability through hard work and careful management, making property productive enough to support subsistence living that garden farming, livestock keeping, and occasional wage labor had sustained. Robert's death in 1959 coal mining accident had devastated Emma, leaving her widowed at age 31 with 8-year-old son to raise alone. Tragedy that had required Emma to assume full responsibility for farm operations while ensuring Tommy received adequate care and education. Challenge that maternal determination had met through working longer hours and through accepting assistance from neighbors whose mountain community solidarity had provided support that isolated widow needed for maintaining property and for raising child. Emma's relationship with Tommy had been extraordinarily close following Robert's death, when mother and son had become inseparable partners whose mutual dependence had created bonds transcending ordinary parent-child relationships. Widow whose entire existence had been organized around ensuring boys' well-being, and child whose helpfulness and whose bright disposition had made him ideal companion for mother, whose loneliness Robert's death had created. Tommy's eagerness to assist with farm chores hadn't merely been obedience but had been expression of love for mother, whose sacrifices boy had recognized even at young age. Child who'd understood that helping Emma with firewood and with other tasks was essential contribution to household whose survival depended on their cooperation. Relationship that had made Tommy's death into total devastation of Emma's world, when losing son had meant losing everything that life after husband's death had been lived for protecting. Tommy's character had been remarkable for 11-year-old child, boy who'd been beloved throughout Hancock County community for friendly greetings and for willingness to help neighbors with tasks, whose performance in school had suggested intelligence and whose teachers had described as having bright future if educational opportunities could be obtained. Child whose innocence and whose enthusiasm for life had made shooting particularly tragic, when potentials that death had eliminated included possibilities that proper survival might have enabled Tommy to escape mountain poverty through education or through other achievements. Neighbors' testimonies during trial had emphasized Tommy's sweetness and his devotion to mother, had described how boy had proudly worn clothing that poverty had made necessary, while maintaining dignity and cheerfulness that circumstances hadn't diminished. Portrait of child whose death represented not merely personal tragedy for Emma, but loss to entire community that had loved 11-year-old whose innocent shooting had destroyed. The October 2nd raids planning had been characterized by institutional carelessness, where aggressive enforcement objectives had overridden basic safety considerations. Operation authorized based on informants' unverified report that Emma Wilson was operating moonshine, still despite absence of corroborating evidence that proper investigation would have required obtaining before conducting raid involving 20 heavily armed agents whose presence on small 40-acre property created obvious dangers that civilian casualties might result from trigger-happy responses to perceived threats. Internal ATF documents that Morrison's research had obtained revealed that supervisors had been warned about insufficient intelligence, but had authorized operation anyway because monthly enforcement quotas required conducting maximum raids, regardless of whether evidence supported operations. Bureaucratic priority that had valued statistical achievements over safety considerations, creating culture where operations were approved without adequate verification, endangering civilians whose presence inadequate reconnaissance had failed identifying. Specific tactics employed during October 2nd raid had been particularly dangerous. Agents approaching property without announcing presence and without attempting to verify whether civilians, particularly children, were present. Aggressive advance that had positioned armed officers throughout area, creating situation where anyone emerging from structures might be perceived as threat justifying deadly force that proper protocols would have prohibited without verbal warnings and without verification. Webb's positioning near house where he'd had clear view of barn had created scenario where Tommy's emergence carrying firewood had been immediately visible. Split-second decision to fire without calling out or without attempting to verify whether boy posed actual threat had demonstrated that agent had been predisposed toward shooting rather than toward carefully assessing situations before employing deadly force. Mindset that institutional culture, encouraging aggressive responses, had created making child's death into predictable outcome that proper training and supervision would have prevented. Tommy's final moments had been characterized by complete innocence and by total lack of awareness that danger existed. 11-year-old who'd been performing afternoon chore routine had established as normal assistance, helping mother prepare for approaching winter. Boy who'd gathered armload of split firewood from barn's storage and who'd been walking toward house anticipating dinner that Emma had been preparing. Child whose thoughts had probably been focused on upcoming birthday, or on school assignments or on other ordinary concerns that youngsters contemplated, rather than on possibility that federal agents were surrounding property, preparing to conduct raid. Tommy's emergence from barn into Webb's sightline had occurred in afternoon daylight. That clearly illuminated boy's small stature and his burden of firewood, visual context that reasonable person would have recognized as child performing household task, rather than as threat requiring immediate deadly force. Obvious innocence that agents' failure to perceive had demonstrated either gross negligence or deliberate disregard for civilian safety that prosecution should have addressed through manslaughter charges. Webb's shotgun blast had struck Tommy in chest at range of approximately 30 yards. Buckshot pattern that forensic analysis would determine had been instantly fatal, causing massive internal injuries that medical examiner had characterized as unsurvivable even with immediate treatment. Death that had been mercifully quick sparing child from prolonged suffering, but that had been completely preventable through basic caution that agent had failed exercising. Tommy's body had collapsed immediately, dropping armload of firewood that had scattered around corpse, creating visual proof that boy had been carrying wood rather than weapon. Evidence that subsequent investigation had documented through photographs showing obvious innocence, that Webb's characterization of perceived threat couldn't reasonably explain when actually shooting had been unjustified homicide that negligence rather than necessity had caused. Emma's witnessing of Tommy's death from kitchen window had been traumatic experience. That maternal instinct had immediately recognized as fatal. Watching son shot and watching boy collapse had created immediate understanding that child was dead, even before rushing outside had confirmed worst fears. Anguished response that had included screaming and desperate attempts to revive Tommy. That futility of situation had made heartbreaking when mother's efforts couldn't restore life that agent's negligence had destroyed. Emma's pleas for agents to help and her accusations that they'd killed innocent child had been ignored when officers had maintained tactical positions preventing interference. Callous response that had communicated that operational security was more important than addressing grieving mother, whose world agents had just destroyed through killing only son that widow had lived for protecting. Institutional indifference that immediate aftermath had demonstrated, and that subsequent complaint dismissal would confirm, making Emma's eventual violence into predictable response that proper accountability would have prevented. Raid's conclusion, after discovering no moonshine equipment, had been particularly bitter when Tommy's death had resulted from operation that shouldn't have been conducted. Agent's departure, leaving Emma with son's body and with destroyed life, had occurred without apologies or without acknowledgements that tragedy had occurred, bureaucratic processing that had treated child's death as unfortunate incident rather than as preventable homicide requiring addressing through prosecution and through compensation. Community's response had been immediate outrage when neighbors had learned that Tommy had been killed during raid, finding no illegal activity. Widespread sympathy for Emma, whose widowhood and whose loss of only child had created profound tragedy that everyone recognized as unjust. Support that had included assistance with funeral arrangements and with property maintenance, that Emma's grief had made impossible to manage alone. Solidarity that had demonstrated that Wilson family's tragedy had been experienced as community violation rather than as merely personal loss. Emma's systematic campaign had been conducted with careful planning. That underestimation of grieving widow had made possible. Agents who dismissed Emma as merely distraught woman hadn't anticipated that maternal grief would motivate coordinated violence or that rural widow would possess weapons skills and determination necessary for conducting systematic eliminations. Miscalculation that had allowed Emma to operate effectively for 11 weeks before surveillance finally caught her approaching target. Each attack had been executed with precision that farm living had developed. Emma approaching victims when isolated and employing close-range shotgun fire that buckshot loads had made instantly fatal. Attacks that had occurred without witnesses and that had left no evidence except ballistics proving same Remington Model 870 had been used. Pattern that investigation had eventually recognized, but that identifying perpetrator had required time during which additional victims had died. Psychological profile developed during investigation had described Emma as woman transformed by grief into determined avenger, whose maternal love had motivated violence that ordinary circumstances would never have provoked. Widow whose loss of both husband and son had eliminated reasons for continuing ordinary existence, creating situation where conducting systematic campaign had become life's purpose, replacing previous focus on raising Tommy and maintaining property. Transformation that had made Emma a formidable adversary, whose single-minded determination and whose lack of concern for personal consequences had enabled sustained violence that most people wouldn't have been capable of executing. Profile had noted that Emma's attacks hadn't been random violence, but had been carefully targeted eliminations, that each victim selection had demonstrated understanding of who'd participated in Tommy's death, or who'd authorized raid, or who'd dismissed complaint. Sophisticated targeting that had required research and planning, demonstrating that grief hadn't made Emma irrational, but had focused maternal rage toward specific individuals whose culpability systematic campaign had been designed to punish. Trial's dramatic moments had included Emma's testimony, where widow had spoken publicly for first time about Tommy's death and about motivations for systematic campaign, emotional account that had described watching son shot while carrying firewood, and that had explained that losing Tommy had destroyed everything following Robert's death 3 years earlier. Testimony that had made clear that violence hadn't been merely revenge, but had been maternal obligation to defend child's memory when institutional systems had refused prosecuting agent whose negligence had killed innocent 11-year-old. Emma's direct examination had been particularly powerful when describing Tommy's character and his helpfulness and his bright future that shooting had eliminated. Mother's love, evident in every word, creating sympathy throughout courtroom, despite prosecution's emphasis on 18 deaths that systematic campaign had caused. Testimony that had complicated jury's deliberations because maternal grief's authenticity had been undeniable, even while acknowledging that violence couldn't be legally justified. Cross-examination had attempted to characterize Emma as cold-blooded killer rather than grieving mother. Prosecution emphasizing that killing 18 people had required planning and determination that exceeded spontaneous maternal grief, arguments that had been undermined when Emma had explained that defending Tommy's memory had been sacred obligation that proper maternal love had demanded fulfilling regardless of legal consequences. That institutional dismissal of wrongful death complaint had left no alternatives except violence when systems had refused prosecuting agent whose negligence had killed child. Prosecution's efforts to suggest that including 7 supervisors demonstrated excessive response had been countered when Emma had explained that everyone whose participation in raid or whose dismissal of complaint had enabled Tommy's death had been equally culpable. That maternal justice had required punishing all who'd contributed to tragedy rather than focusing only on Webb, who'd pulled trigger. Defense's closing argument had emphasized Tommy's complete innocence and Webb's negligence, and ATF's dismissal of complaint, had argued that while systematic violence couldn't be legally justified, jury should recognize that Emma's actions had been motivated by profound maternal grief that institutional failures had created through refusing to prosecute child's preventable death. That convicting widow who'd lost everything would be adding injustice to tragedy, when actually federal government bore responsibility for creating situation where desperate mother had felt violence was only means for obtaining accountability. Prosecution's closing had countered that regardless of sympathy for Emma's loss, 18 people were dead and families were grieving. That criminal law couldn't excuse systematic murder regardless of provocations. That jury's duty was to convict based on overwhelming evidence proving deliberate killings rather than on emotional appeals about maternal grief. Jury's 21-day deliberation had involved extensive debates about whether Tommy's death created mitigation that might excuse some killings even while requiring convictions for others. Discussions about whether Webb's death might be partially justified while targeting of supervisors represented excessive response. Deliberations that had examined each victim separately, attempting to assess culpability for Tommy's death, and whether Emma's actions toward specific individuals might be understood as proportional responses to their participation in tragedy. Eventually, jury had concluded that while Tommy's death had been preventable and while ATF's dismissal of complaint had been unjust, systematic nature of campaign and inclusion of supervisory targets whose involvement had been administrative required convicting on all counts because overwhelming evidence proved premeditated murders rather than spontaneous violence that immediate grief might have provoked. Decision that had reflected belief that maternal grief, while profound, couldn't legally justify coordinated killings that careful planning had characterized.